The place card was already there. Myrtle Morgan stood in the doorway of the Atkins ranch house dining room, her travel-worn boots rooted to the threshold, her heart hammering against her ribs like a fist against a locked door. The long oak table stretched before her, set with more care than she had seen in years, pressed linen, polished tin candlesticks, a ceramic pitcher of wildflowers pulled fresh from the Texas hill country. And there, between the chair at the head of the table and the one occupied by Alfred Atkins himself, was a hand-painted card bearing her name in careful, deliberate script. Myrtle, not Miss Morgan, not the schoolteacher from Haskell. Just Myrtle, as though she already belonged here, as though someone had already decided she did. She looked at Alfred. He looked back at her with an expression she could not read. Guilt, she thought, or something very close to it tangled up with something else she refused to name. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat against the table. He had not stood when she entered, which told her everything she needed to know about the fact that he had been expecting this moment and had no idea how to survive it. "I told her no," Myrtle said. Her voice was very quiet and very dangerous. Alfred said nothing. "I sent the letter back, Alfred. I wrote very clearly that I was not coming to supper. I had obligations. I told her I appreciated the invitation, and I declined." From the kitchen doorway appeared Cordelia Atkins, Alfred's mother, a woman of 62 with iron-gray hair pinned into submission, and eyes the color of deep creek water, warm and calculating at the same time. She was carrying a cast iron pot that smelled of slow-cooked venison and sage, and she set it on the table with the serene authority of a woman who had never in her life taken no for an answer. "Myrtle, dear," Cordelia said, as though the tension in the room were simply a draft she could shut out by closing a window, "you are here now and the food is hot. Sit down." "Mrs. Atkins," Myrtle began. "Sit down, child." Cordelia's voice was not unkind. It was absolute. And that was the moment, the precise, infuriating, strangely moving moment that cracked the anger in Myrtle's chest just wide enough for something else to squeeze through. Because Cordelia Atkins was not manipulating her out of cruelty. The woman was not running some dark trap laid out to humiliate her. She was doing what stubborn, loving women of the frontier had always done when they saw something worth fighting for. She had set a place at her table. And Myrtle Morgan, who had spent the last 3 years of her life learning that no one saved a place for her anywhere, felt the ground shift under her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the Texas soil. She sat down, and the story of how she had arrived at this particular table, in this particular house, with this particular man watching her from across the linen, was a story that had begun not with an invitation at all, but with a fire. It had begun in the spring of 1881, on a Tuesday in late April, in the town of Haskell, Texas, when the schoolhouse burned down. Myrtle Morgan had arrived in Haskell the previous September, having come from Abilene on the back of a borrowed determination and a single trunk of books. She was 26 years old, trained in letters and arithmetic at a women's college in Missouri, and possessed of a sharp intelligence that the men of most frontier towns found either admirable or deeply inconvenient, depending on their own relationship with their pride. Haskell was a small community, barely 400 souls, pressed against the rolling grassland of West Texas like a man leaning into a hard wind. It had a general store, a saloon, a Methodist church, a post office, a livery, 2 competing dry goods merchants who had not spoken directly to one another in 6 years, and a schoolhouse that Myrtle had come to love the way people love things they know are fragile. The schoolhouse was a single-room frame building on the eastern edge of town, painted white 3 years ago and now peeling in long strips that curled back like the pages of a bad book. It held 32 children between the ages of 5 and 14, and it held Myrtle, who arrived every morning at 7, lit the stove, wrote the day's lessons on the chalkboard, and proceeded to teach with the fierce, quiet passion of someone who understood that education was not a luxury on the frontier. It was the only ladder that reached out of the dust. She had been good at her work. She had been more than good. She had been devoted. And then on a Tuesday morning in late April, the stovepipe separated from the wall while she was walking the youngest children through their letters. And by the time the bucket brigade had assembled from 3 streets away, the schoolhouse was beyond saving. No children were hurt. Myrtle had gotten them all out, walking the last 2 out under her own arms while the smoke thickened behind her. She had stood in the street and watched the building come down with the kind of stillness that people mistake for calm, but which is actually a person holding themselves together with nothing but will. The town had been sympathetic. Then the town had been practical. The school board, 5 men who met on the first Thursday of every month above the general store, had determined that the schoolhouse would need to be rebuilt, that this would take at minimum 3 months and possibly 4, and that in the meantime, they simply could not pay a schoolteacher to teach when there was nowhere to teach. They had let her go. Gently, with sincere apologies and a firm promise to rehire her when the building was done. But they had let her go. And so Myrtle found herself in the peculiar and terrifying position of a woman alone on the Texas frontier with $22, a trunk of books, no immediate family within 500 miles, and no income. Her landlady, Mrs. Prout, had been understanding but honest. She could give Myrtle a month, perhaps 6 weeks, but she ran a boarding house, not a charity. The options available to a woman of Myrtle's circumstances in 1881 Texas were not generous. She could take domestic work, cooking, cleaning, laundry. She could attempt to find work in one of the larger towns to the east. She could write to her aunt in St. Louis, who had made it very clear at their last parting 3 years prior that she considered Myrtle's decision to go west an act of spectacular foolishness, and would only receive her back with the words, "I told you so," already primed and loaded. Or she could answer the advertisement that Mrs. Prout had cut from the Abilene paper and left on Myrtle's breakfast tray one morning without comment, which read as follows: "Wanted. A woman of education and practical character to serve as private tutor and household teacher to 2 children, ages 7 and 9, at the Atkins Cattle Ranch 12 miles south of Haskell. Room, board, and fair wages provided. Inquiries to be addressed to Mrs. Cordelia Atkins." Myrtle had read the advertisement 3 times. She had set it down. She had eaten her breakfast. She had picked it up and read it again. She did not want to be a private tutor on a cattle ranch. She was a school teacher, and she wanted her school back. And the idea of retreating from the public classroom to some rancher's parlor felt to her like a step in the wrong direction, like a door closing on the version of herself she had been working to build. But $22 did not argue with reason the way pride did, and so she had written to Cordelia Atkins, and Cordelia Atkins had written back within 4 days with terms so fair and a tone so warm that Myrtle had felt slightly suspicious of the whole arrangement from the start. She had arrived at the Atkins Ranch on the 2nd of May, 1881, delivered by the postal rider who ran the road south twice a week. The ranch was larger than she had imagined, a proper spread, with a main house built of stone and cedar, a barn, 2 outbuildings, a bunkhouse for the hands, and a kitchen garden that had been tended with genuine care. Cattle moved on the far hills like slow brown thoughts. The sky above it all was enormous and absolutely indifferent to human anxiety, which Myrtle found both intimidating and, after 3 years of frontier living, quietly comforting. Cordelia Atkins had met her at the gate. She was not what Myrtle had expected. The warmth in the letters had suggested a soft woman, perhaps someone rounded by years and comfort. Cordelia was not soft. She was spare and direct, with hands that showed decades of work and a face that showed decades of thinking. And she looked at Myrtle for a full 3 seconds before she said, "You are exactly what I hoped for," in a tone that Myrtle found both flattering and slightly alarming. The 2 children were Henry, age 9, a serious-faced boy who collected rocks and knew the name of every plant within walking distance of the ranch, and Clara, age 7, who was brilliant and relentless and had already, according to her grandmother, taught herself to read from the family Bible and was now deeply dissatisfied with the rest of the world's literacy level. Myrtle liked them both immediately. They were easy children to like, curious, eager, a little wild in the way children raised on open land tend to be, but fundamentally kind. Alfred Atkins she did not meet until her second day. He had been out on the range when she arrived, dealing with a fence line that a spring storm had knocked down across 300 yards of the south pasture. He rode in at dusk on the first evening, unsaddled his horse, washed at the outdoor pump, and came to supper without knowing Myrtle was already seated at the table. She heard him in the hall, the sound of boots, the particular weight of a man who worked with his body, and then he was in the doorway and he stopped. He was 30 years old, taller than she had expected, with dark hair pushed back from a face that the sun had worked on honestly without cruelty. He had his mother's eyes, that deep creekwater quality, but where Cordelia's eyes calculated, Alfred simply saw. He looked at Myrtle the way you look at something you were not expecting to find beautiful, and then he looked away because he was the kind of man who thought it was rude to stare. "Miss Morgan," Cordelia said from her seat, perfectly composed, "this is my son Alfred. Alfred, this is Miss Myrtle Morgan, who will be teaching Henry and Clara." "Miss Morgan," Alfred said. He came to the table and sat down across from her, and he said nothing more for a full 10 minutes, which told Myrtle he was either very quiet by nature or thinking about something very hard. She decided it was probably both. The arrangement was straightforward. Myrtle taught the children from 8 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, using the front parlor, which Cordelia had cleared and furnished with a proper writing table and 2 small desks that Alfred had apparently built himself over the winter. The afternoons were her own, more or less. She helped in the kitchen when it seemed useful and not intrusive. She walked. She read. She wrote long letters to the school board in Haskell, inquiring firmly about the progress of the reconstruction and making sure they did not forget her. Alfred was a rancher in the way that some men are ministers, wholly, without visible reservation. He was up before dawn and often not back until the light was going, and the ranch moved around him like something he had called into being through sheer, consistent effort. He managed 1,200 head of cattle and a crew of 5 cowhands, negotiated with buyers in Abilene, kept his own accounts, maintained the equipment, and still somehow found time to help Henry with a project involving the cataloging of local stone varieties that had begun as a school assignment and expanded into something that filled 3 notebooks. Myrtle noticed this about him, the way he made time for things that mattered, even when he had no time. She noticed the notebooks on the parlor shelf, and one evening she asked Henry about them, and Henry said with great seriousness, "Papa helps me write the descriptions. He knows all the names, too." This information settled in her chest like a pebble dropped into still water, creating rings that spread outward in directions she was not yet prepared to examine. She was not there to fall in love. She was there to teach 2 children until her school was rebuilt, and then she was going back to Haskell, back to her classroom, back to the work that was hers. She had made this very clear to herself on multiple occasions, in the quiet of her room at night, when the house had gone still, and the Texas night pressed its dark weight against the window glass. The problem was that the Atkins ranch had a quality she had not accounted for. It had the quality of a home, not just a house. A home, the kind built not from lumber and stone, but from accumulated days of people caring for one another without being asked. It was in the way Cordelia left a lamp lit in the hall for Alfred when he came in late. It was in the way Alfred, without fail, asked the children at supper what they had learned that day, and listened to the answer, the way most adults do not listen to children with genuine attention, following up, asking more. It was in the way Henry would take Myrtle's hand unself-consciously when they walked to the garden to gather specimens, and in the way Clara had taken to ending her school day by reading 1 page of whatever she was working on aloud to the chickens in the yard, which she had explained to Myrtle was for practice in public speaking. Myrtle had laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that escaped before she could be dignified about it, and she had looked up to find Alfred watching her from the fence where he was working leather, and the expression on his face was so unguarded and so warm that she had felt it in her throat. That was the first time she recognized that she was in danger. She did not act on it. She pulled herself back into the careful posture of a professional woman in a domestic arrangement, and she kept her walls maintained, and she told herself that warmth was not love, that proximity was not intimacy, that a man who was kind to her children did not automatically deserve anything from her heart. But the summer came on, and with it heat that turned the hills gold and the evenings into something too beautiful to be entirely safe. Suppers stretched longer as the days stretched longer, and conversation grew roots the way things do in long evening light. She learned that Alfred had taken over the ranch at 22 when his father died of a fever that swept through the region in the winter of 1873, that he had done it before he was fully ready, that there had been a period of genuine hardship, debt, near failure, and that he had come through it not by luck, but by the kind of stubborn, methodical courage that does not make for dramatic stories but keeps families fed. She learned that he had been married once, briefly, to a woman named Louisa who had come from San Antonio with a romantic idea of ranch life that the reality of West Texas had dismantled with brutal efficiency. Louisa had gone back to San Antonio when Henry was 3 and Clara was 1, and the children barely remembered her, and Alfred spoke of her without bitterness and without sentimentality, with the neutral clarity of someone who had long since processed the grief of it and arrived at a place of simple understanding. The marriage had been a mistake made by two people who did not know each other well enough. No villain, no betrayal, just a fundamental mismatch between a woman's dreams and a man's land. "Do you miss her?" Myrtle had asked once, surprising herself. Alfred had thought about it for a moment. "I miss the idea I had of what it would be," he said. "I don't miss her specifically." "That sounds harder than I mean it to." "It doesn't sound hard at all," Myrtle said. "It sounds honest." He had looked at her then with a look that she filed away in the back of her mind and did not open for several weeks. Cordelia, for her part, was not subtle about her intentions. Myrtle had understood within the first 2 weeks that the advertisement in the Abilene paper had been, at least in part, a form of strategic intervention. Cordelia loved her son without reservation and worried about him without cessation. And what she worried about specifically was the particular kind of loneliness that settles into a person who is too capable and too private to ask for what they need. Alfred had been alone, truly alone, in the deepest sense, for 7 years. He had the children and the ranch and his mother, and a deep, genuine contentment with physical labor and open land. But there was a part of him that had gone quiet in a way that Cordelia found heartbreaking. She had not placed the advertisement hoping to trick her son. She had placed it because she trusted her own judgment about people, and her judgment told her that a woman of Myrtle's particular qualities, sharp, warm beneath the sharpness, principled, deeply real, was exactly the sort of person her son needed in proximity to remember that he was more than a rancher and a father. The trap, if you wanted to call it that, was a trap of kindness, and Myrtle could feel it around her like a net, and she did not entirely resent it, which disturbed her more than the trap itself. In June, there was an incident with the South herd that changed things between Alfred and Myrtle in ways that neither of them planned. A pair of cattle thieves had been working the region, 2 men from a rough outfit operating out of the breaks north of the Colorado River, who had been helping themselves to unguarded stock from ranches in a wide arc. Alfred had lost 11 head in a single night and had spent 2 days following sign with his foreman, a quiet, capable man named Denton Marsh, who was 40 and had been with the Atkins ranch for 12 years. They had found where the stock was being held, notified the county sheriff, and the matter had been resolved with the law, as Alfred insisted. He was not a man for violence when law was available, and in 1881 the law in that county was available and reasonably functional. What Myrtle had not known was that on the second night of Alfred's absence, when the ranch was quiet and she and Cordelia were the only adults on the property, the cowhands being out with Alfred, she had heard someone moving around the outbuildings at 2 in the morning. She had lain awake for 10 minutes, reasoning with herself, and then she had gotten up, dressed, taken the lamp and the small pistol she had carried since Abilene, and gone out to check. It was nothing. A coyote had gotten into the chicken coop, and the chickens were making their outrage known. Myrtle had secured the coop, shooed the coyote with considerably more authority than the coyote expected from a woman in a nightgown, and gone back to bed. But she had been seen through the window by Cordelia, who had been doing exactly the same thing Myrtle was doing, getting up to check, and who had watched Myrtle handle the situation with the calm competence of someone who had been taking care of herself for a very long time without anyone taking care of her in return. When Alfred came back the next evening, Cordelia told him what she had seen. He found Myrtle at the parlor table grading Henry's arithmetic, and he stood in the doorway for a moment and then said, "My mother tells me you handled a coyote situation last night." "It was not very dramatic," Myrtle said without looking up from the page. "The coyote was more surprised than I was." "Still," Alfred said, "thank you for looking after things." She looked up then, because there was something in his voice that was different from his usual tone, something rougher and quieter at the same time, something personal. And she found him looking at her with an expression she recognized this time, because she had been honest enough with herself by then to recognize it in her own mirror. "You would have done it yourself if you had been here," she said. "I wasn't here," he said. "You were. That matters." It was not a declaration. It was not even, strictly speaking, a compliment. But it was one of those small true things said in plain language that land harder than any amount of elaborate feeling, and Myrtle felt it settle in her chest beside the pebble she had dropped there 2 months earlier, and the rings they made together were wider than she could comfortably measure. July brought the invitation. Cordelia came to Myrtle's room on a Thursday evening and sat down in the chair by the window with the directness of a woman who does not believe in preamble, and told her that she was hosting a small supper the following Sunday, just family, no neighbors, just the 5 of them at the table, and she would like Myrtle to join them not as the household teacher but simply as a guest. Myrtle said thank you and that she would have to see about Sunday, and Cordelia said, "I have already set a place for you," with perfect tranquility, as though the matter were administrative rather than emotional. The invitation itself was not alarming. What was alarming was that Myrtle wanted to go. Not in the polite sense of wanting to be agreeable to an employer's request, but in the deep personal sense of wanting to sit at that table and be part of what it held, the warmth, the children's voices, the long evening light coming through the west windows, Alfred passing the bread without being asked, because he had already noticed everyone's hands were occupied. She wanted it the way you want things that you know are too good for your current circumstances to allow, and that wanting frightened her because wanting things was how you got hurt. She had been hurt before. Not by a man specifically, though there had been that too, a man in Abilene who had been everything promising and nothing true, who had spoken beautifully of a future, and then written one letter to explain that he had decided on a different future with a woman whose father owned a bank, and the best of luck to Myrtle in all her endeavors. She had survived that with her pride mostly intact and a very clear understanding of the cost of opening yourself to someone who has not earned it. But the older hurt, the deeper one, was not about a man. It was about a family. Myrtle's own family, her father, who had been a good man undone by drink before she was 12, and her mother, who had held things together with terrifying discipline until she couldn't, and the particular peculiar loneliness of a child who learned early that the table you were born to might not hold a place for you regardless of how well you tried to earn it. She had made her own place, deliberately, out of work and will and books, and the absolute conviction that if she was capable enough, she would never need anyone to save one for her. And here was Cordelia Atkins, setting a place without being asked, and it was the most frightening thing anyone had done to Myrtle Morgan in years. She wrote back declining. She was polite. She cited obligations. There were some letters she needed to write. There was a chapter she was working through with Clara that she thought deserved uninterrupted time. She thanked Cordelia and said another time would be lovely. Cordelia said nothing in response. She received the note, presumably read it, and then on Sunday afternoon when Myrtle was sitting in her room writing letters, she heard the knock at her door. It was Alfred. He was dressed for supper, not formally. There was nothing formal about Alfred Atkins, but he had changed his shirt and run a comb through his hair, and he looked like a man who was about to do something that cost him something. He stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "Miss Morgan, Myrtle, my mother is about to serve supper and she would like you to come to the table." Myrtle looked at him. "I sent a note declining." "I know," he said. "She mentioned that." And a pause. A long one by Alfred's standards. He looked at the floor and then back at her and he said, "And she set your place anyway, and the children asked for you, and he stopped, started again. "I think you should come, because your mother asked." "Because I am asking," he said, quiet, direct, entirely dangerously honest. "I would like you at my table, Myrtle." And she had looked at him for a long moment, and then she had closed her book and she had come. Which is how she found herself in the doorway of the Atkins dining room with the place card and her name already set, her heart making a mess of her composure, and Cordelia Atkins setting down a cast iron pot of venison stew with the serene certainty of a woman who has never in 62 years let a fixable problem go unfixed. She sat down. Henry immediately began telling her about a piece of granite he had found that afternoon that he believed showed evidence of a fault line, and Clara passed her the bread with the grave courtesy of a 7-year-old who understands hospitality on a cellular level. And Cordelia poured the coffee, and Alfred, across the table, said nothing at all, just watched her settle into the chair, watched her accept the bread, watched the tension in her shoulders make its slow surrender. And when she finally glanced up and found his eyes on her, he did something she had never seen him do in 2 months of sharing meals at that table. He smiled. Not the small functional smile he gave when something was mildly satisfactory, a real one, unguarded and wide, that changed the whole architecture of his face and made him look, for one unprotected moment, exactly as happy as he was. Myrtle looked back down at her plate. Her hands were not quite steady. Cordelia caught her eye across the table and said nothing, but the look on her face was the look of a woman whose gamble had just paid out. The supper lasted 2 hours. Henry talked at length about geological formations and the possibility that their land sat on an ancient riverbed, which Myrtle confirmed was geologically probable given the sediment layers she had observed along the creek, which led Henry to stare at her with the reverence usually reserved for prophets. Clara read aloud the first paragraph of a story she was writing, which concerned a young woman who discovered that her horse could speak French, and it was funny and odd and genuinely inventive. Cordelia told a story about a winter blizzard in 1867 that had trapped her, her late husband James, and 3 ranch hands in the barn for 4 days with nothing to eat but dried corn and an excellent bottle of whiskey that James had been saving for a special occasion. "What became of the whiskey?" Myrtle asked. "We were in the barn 4 days," Cordelia said. "What do you think became of it?" And then they were all laughing, even Alfred, and the evening light came through the windows and the candles on the table were lit as the sun went down, and when it was over and the children were put to bed and Cordelia had retired, Myrtle and Alfred found themselves standing on the front porch in the warm Texas dark. "Thank you for asking me," she said. "Thank you for coming," he said. A silence that was not uncomfortable. The kind of silence 2 people fall into when they are both thinking the same thing and neither of them is quite ready to say it. "Your mother," Myrtle said finally. "I know," Alfred said. "She's relentless." "She is," he agreed. "She means well. She always means well." It doesn't make her less terrifying, he paused. But she's usually right. I've stopped arguing with that. Myrtle leaned against the porch post and looked out at the dark hills, at the stars that the Texas sky showed off with a generosity that felt almost excessive. I am going back to Haskell, she said, when the school is rebuilt. I know, Alfred said. I want that made clear. It is clear. Another silence. She felt him beside her, the warmth of him, the solid, quiet presence that she had been feeling for 2 months and steadily refusing to name. What if Haskell took longer than expected? He said. His voice was careful. I would find that inconvenient, she said. Would you? She turned her head and looked at him, and he was watching her the way he had watched her at supper, without the shield she had expected, without the careful distance of a man protecting himself. He was simply there, open to the answer she was going to give. Alfred, she said. Yes. I don't know how to do this carefully. Neither do I, he said. I was going to mention that. She laughed again, that unguarded laugh, the one she couldn't manage around anyone else without working at it. And he smiled and looked back at the stars, and neither of them said anything more, and somehow that was exactly the right amount for one evening. The weeks that followed were a kind of carefully maintained mutual understanding that both of them continued to insist, privately and to themselves, was not what it was. Alfred found reasons to be present at the ranch during the hours Myrtle might be in the garden with the children, or on the porch in the late afternoon with a book. Not obtrusively, he never forced it. He would simply be there, working on something nearby, and conversation would happen the way it does when two people have the same gravitational pull toward each other and don't fight the physics too hard. They talked about everything. About education and what it meant to bring a school to a place that had none. About the cattle industry and the coming of the railroads and what the next decade would do to the open range. About Henry's geological ambitions and whether they might one day lead somewhere real. Alfred thought so, and his confidence in his son's strange passion was the kind of uncomplicated, undiluted parental faith that Myrtle found almost unbearably moving. About Clara, who was already writing stories and whom Myrtle believed had a mind that deserved every opportunity that could be found for it. And Alfred agreed with a warmth and without any of the hesitation about a daughter's ambitions that Myrtle had encountered in most men. She told him, one evening in late July, about her father. Not all of it, not the darkest parts, but enough. The way the drink had changed him, the slow erosion of a man she had once admired. The way her mother had adapted by becoming something harder and less reachable. The way Myrtle had decided at 15 that she would build herself an interior life so rich and so entirely her own that no one's erosion could touch its foundations. Alfred listened without attempting to fix it or offer consolation that minimized it. When she was done, he said, "Is that why you work so hard at being self-sufficient?" "Probably," she said. "Is it obvious?" "Only to someone who's looking," he said. She looked at him steadily. "And you are looking." "I have been looking since the first evening," he said simply. "I thought it was better to be honest about that." Myrtle's heart did something complicated and irreversible in her chest. "Alfred," she said. "I know," he said. "You're going back to Haskell." "I was going to say," she said carefully, "that I think I may have been wrong about some things." He was very still. "About what I want," she said. "About what I thought I needed and what I thought I was afraid of. I may have been wrong about the nature of the trap." She looked at the hills. "Your mother set a place for me, not to control me, not to own me, just because she thought there should be room for me." "There is room for you," Alfred said. The words were so plain, so direct, so entirely without performance or manipulation, nothing hidden, no dark motive, no agenda she needed to defend against. Just a man who had made space and was telling her it was there. "I need to think about the school," she said. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'm not saying no," she said. "I know you're not," he said. And she looked at him and he was smiling again, that real, full smile, and she thought, with perfect clarity, that she was thoroughly and irrevocably in love with Alfred Atkins, and that the most frightening thing about it was not the vulnerability but the fact that it had stopped frightening her. August came. A letter arrived from the Haskell School Board informing Miss Morgan that the new schoolhouse was progressing well, and they hoped to be ready for the autumn term, that she might expect to be needed by the 1st of September at the latest, and they were looking forward to her return. She read the letter at the kitchen table while Cordelia was making biscuits and the children were at their lessons in the parlor. She read it twice, and then she folded it very carefully and set it on the table, and Cordelia, without turning from the stove, said, "Good news." "The school is nearly rebuilt," Myrtle said. Cordelia was quiet for a moment. Then, "What will you do?" Myrtle looked at the folded letter. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. Cordelia turned from the stove. She looked at Myrtle with those deep, calculating, genuinely warm eyes, and she said something Myrtle had not expected. "I want to tell you something," she said. "And I want you to hear it as a mother speaking to a woman she respects, not as an employer or a matchmaker or any of the other things you may think I am." Myrtle waited. "I placed that advertisement in the Abilene paper because my son has been alone for too long and I am 72 years old, no, 62. But some mornings it feels like 72, and I will not always be here to keep this house the way it is." She paused. "But the reason I kept you here, the reason I invited you to that table and put your name on that card, is not because you were convenient for Alfred. It's because you walked into this house and it felt different. It felt more like itself." Myrtle's throat tightened. "A home doesn't know it's missing something until the missing thing arrives," Cordelia said. She turned back to her biscuits. "That's all. Do with it what you think is right." That evening, after supper, when the children were in bed and Cordelia had said her good nights with the strategic timing of a general who knows when to leave the field, Myrtle found Alfred on the porch where he always was in the evenings. He had a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and he was looking at the dark hills with the thoughtful, quiet attention he gave everything. She sat down beside him. Not in the chair, she sat on the porch step, close enough that their arms nearly touched. "I got a letter from Haskell today," she said. He set down the coffee cup. "1st of September. "Yes." Silence. "Alfred," she said, "I have been a school teacher because it was the truest thing I could find that was entirely mine. I built it from nothing and it was mine and I was going to defend it." "I know," he said. "And then your mother set a place for me at her table." She paused. "And I realized that having a place set for you, having someone say there is room here, that doesn't diminish what is yours. It just means what is yours is larger than you thought." He turned to look at her in the dark, and she could see his face by the faint lamplight from the window, and what was on it was everything she had been cataloging for 3 months, the honest warmth, the steady, undemanding hope. "I would not ask you to stop teaching," he said. "Haskell needs a teacher. The children here need one. There's no reason those things have to be separate." "No," she agreed. "There isn't." "Is that what you're saying?" She turned fully toward him. "I am saying," she said, very carefully and very clearly, "that I am in love with you, Alfred Atkins, and I have been for some time, and I am tired of being careful about it." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man receiving something he has hoped for long enough that he has forgotten exactly how it would feel to receive it. Then he reached out and took her hand. His hand was large and warm and calloused from work, and it closed around hers with the kind of gentleness that is more convincing than force because it is deliberate. He did not say anything for a moment. When he did speak, his voice was quiet and entirely sure. "I have loved you since the night you told me you were going back to Haskell," he said, "because that was the first moment I understood what it would cost to lose you here." Myrtle pressed her other hand over his. "That was July." "Yes, it was. You are a patient man." "I have been called worse," he said. She laughed and he laughed, and in the warm Texas night with the stars doing their extravagant display overhead and the cattle moving like distant shadows on the hills, Alfred Atkins leaned forward and kissed Myrtle Morgan with the careful, deliberate tenderness of a man who has been waiting long enough to know exactly how much it matters. She kissed him back with no careful distance at all. Inside the house, in the kitchen, Cordelia Atkins heard the laughter from the porch and set down her knitting and permitted herself the smallest, most satisfied smile of the last several decades. They were formal about it, because the time called for formality, and Alfred understood that Myrtle needed the formality, not as a barrier, but as a structure that confirmed the seriousness of what was being offered. He spoke to her again the following morning in daylight, with both of them clear-headed and unromantic in the practical light of a Texas morning, and he asked her plainly, without flourish, if she would consider a courtship with the understanding that his intentions were entirely toward marriage, and that he would never ask her to surrender her work, her independence, or any piece of herself she had built. Myrtle said yes. She wrote to the Haskell School Board the same day, a letter that she spent considerable time composing, in which she informed them that she would be returning to begin the autumn term as agreed, that she expected to fulfill her obligations to the school and to the community, and that she anticipated being in Haskell 3 days a week to manage the classroom, with the remaining time spent at a residence 12 miles south of town, which she expected to make permanent. She asked whether the board might be willing to work with this arrangement, and she made the case for it clearly and without apology. The school board deliberated for a week, and then wrote back saying that given Miss Morgan's exceptional record and the difficulty they had experienced in finding a qualified teacher willing to come to Haskell, they were willing to try the arrangement on a trial basis. That was September of 1881. By October, the arrangement was working. Myrtle taught in Haskell on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. She was at the ranch the other days, and on those days she taught Henry and Clara in the mornings and spent the afternoons as a woman who was, very carefully and very genuinely, learning what it meant to belong somewhere. She and Alfred walked in the evenings along the creek. They talked the way people talk when they are building something together, not just with feeling but with intention. He told her things he had not told anyone, about the fear that had lived in him for years after his wife left, not grief exactly, but a deep uncertainty about his own judgment that had made him very careful and very slow. About the way he had raised Henry and Clara with that care, investing everything in being present, not being absent the way a man could be absent even while sitting at the same table. About the particular dream he had for the ranch, not to expand indefinitely, the way some men were driven to, but to make it good, to make it sustainable, to build something that Henry and Clara could inherit and choose what to do with freely. Myrtle told him her own fears with the same honesty, about the bone-deep terror of needing someone too much, of arranging your life around a person who might rearrange themselves without warning. He listened. He did not dismiss it or try to argue her out of it. He said, "I think the only answer to that fear is time, and I have nothing but time for you." Henry, who was by now Myrtle's devoted academic companion, presented her with a small piece of rose quartz on a Thursday in October, and told her very seriously that it was a Cambrian period mineral sample, and that she was welcome to keep it for her collection, which was Alfred's way of having communicated to his son that things had changed. Henry's endorsement was implicit and absolute. Clara, for her part, had already begun writing a story in which the main character was a schoolteacher who married a farmer. The farmer had been described, Myrtle noticed when she reviewed the draft, as tall and with good teeth, which she assumed was 7-year-old Clara's highest bar of physical attractiveness. November arrived, and with it the question that had been approaching since August. Alfred asked Myrtle to marry him on the first Saturday of November, 1881, standing in the kitchen garden at the end of the day when the light was going gold, and the air had the first real edge of autumn in it. He did not have a ring. He told her that honestly, said he could get one in Abilene if she wanted one, but he had decided he would rather ask her without one than wait for the props to be in order. He asked her in plain words with his whole self behind them and nothing hidden, nothing held back. Myrtle said yes. She said it once clearly, and then she stepped forward and put her head against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, and they stood in the kitchen garden for a long time while the light finished its gold going, and the first stars came out, and the Texas night settled around them like something they had both been inside for a very long time without knowing it. Cordelia heard about it over supper. She received the news with a composure so profound it was nearly theatrical, made a brief remark about the biscuits being particularly good that evening, and then excused herself for a moment, and when she came back her eyes were red, which she attributed, entirely unconvincingly, to the cook fire. The wedding was in January of 1882. Small by choice, the Methodist Church in Haskell, Reverend Briggs officiating, with the school board's chairman and his wife as witnesses on Myrtle's side and Denton Marsh and his wife on Alfred's. Henry wore his best shirt and stood very straight. Clara wore a white hair ribbon that she had demanded specifically, and she carried a small bunch of winter-dried flowers from the garden with the gravity of someone performing a sacred duty, which she was. Myrtle wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool she had ordered from Abilene, not white. She had decided, because she was 26 and a schoolteacher, and she would wear what suited her. The dress was simple and fitted and precisely right, and Alfred, when he saw her walk into the church, said something under his breath that Denton Marsh later reported to his wife had sounded like, "Good Lord," with significant reverence. Reverend Briggs kept the ceremony simple. The words they said to each other in that cold January church were plain and old and exactly sufficient. When they were done, Alfred took Myrtle's hand and held it, and did not let go through the entirety of the reception at the church hall, which consisted of coffee and cake, and the school board's chairman making a speech about community that went on longer than necessary and was cut short by Cordelia Atkins, who simply stood up when he paused for breath and said, "Thank you, Emmett. The cake is getting cold." They went home to the ranch in the evening, the 5 of them in Alfred's wagon, the children asleep against each other before they were halfway there. The sky was immense and clear and lit with more stars than seemed reasonable, and Myrtle sat beside her husband on the wagon bench and felt something she had spent years protecting herself against feeling. She felt safe, not dependent safe. The way a place is safe, or a habit, or a truth you can set down without worrying it will disappear while your back is turned. She felt like a woman who had come to the right place at last, and she felt it without mourning for the other routes she had not taken, because the place she had arrived at seemed to justify every choice that had delivered her here, including the bad ones. Alfred, without taking his eyes from the road, took her hand in the dark. Spring of 1882 brought several things. The school in Haskell entered its second year under Myrtle's teaching and had by now expanded to 38 students, several of whom had older siblings who were now formally too old for school, but who occasionally appeared on Saturday mornings asking if Myrtle would help them with reading or arithmetic, and she always did, because that was who she was. The school board, having seen what they had, stopped asking questions about the 3-days-a-week arrangement and simply considered themselves fortunate. Henry's geological notebooks had expanded to 7 volumes, and Myrtle had written a letter to a professor at a university in Austin describing the work and asking whether there might be correspondence or resources available to a 9-year-old with unusual scientific gifts. The professor had written back with interest, and a correspondence had begun that Henry guarded with fierce pride, writing his replies at the parlor table with his tongue slightly out and his forehead furrowed. Clara finished her story about the talking horse and began a second one, this one about a girl who traveled west alone, which Myrtle found personally significant and declined to analyze too closely. And in May of 1882, Myrtle told Alfred that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen after the children had gone to bed and Cordelia had retired, and she said it directly because she was not a woman who wrapped things in preliminary. She had been sitting with the knowledge for 2 weeks, verifying it in the ways available to women of 1882, and she was certain, and she acknowledged this to herself as she said the words frightened and happy in almost equal measure. Alfred received the information in silence for approximately 5 seconds. Then he stood up from the table and came around to her chair and crouched down so he was at eye level with her and took both her hands in his and said, "Are you well? Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. "I am more well than I have been in a long time." "Good," he said, "good." And he held her hands very carefully, the way you hold something you understand to be precious. "I will not pretend I am not happy," he said. "Please don't," she said. "I am happy too." Cordelia found out the next morning when Alfred told her before breakfast, and the sound she made was not a small sound. She held Myrtle's face in both hands for a moment and looked at her with eyes that had gone fully undone, and she said, "This house is going to be exactly what it should be." With the absolute certainty of a woman who has finally arrived at the outcome she went into the plan believing in. The summer was gentle. Myrtle kept teaching through June, reduced her days to 2 per week as July arrived, and the Texas heat found a new intensity. She worked in the kitchen garden in the mornings when it was still cool. She sat on the porch in the afternoons and read or wrote, and Alfred contrived to be present during the hours when she might need something, managing to do this without hovering, which she appreciated enormously. There were difficult days when the fear she had been carrying since childhood reasserted itself, and she lay awake at 2 in the morning in the grip of the ancient certainty that good things were temporary and trust was a liability. Alfred, who seemed to have developed a sensitivity to these nights, would simply put his hand on her back in the dark and say nothing, and the warmth of it would gradually dismantle the fear back to its proper size. She told him once on one of those nights about the full depth of it, about the table that had never had her name on it, about the years of making herself sufficient so that the absence of a place would not matter, about the radical terror of having a place and loving it so much that the thought of losing it was worse than having never had it. He listened in the dark for a long time. Then he said, "Myrtle, I am not going anywhere, and neither are you. And even if the worst happened, even if everything changed, you would still be Myrtle Morgan, who rebuilt herself from nothing before and could again." A pause. "But it's not going to happen. And I need you to know that what we have is not fragile." "How do you know?" she asked. "Because I built it like I build everything else," he said, "for permanence." She laughed despite herself, and he pulled her close, and the fear went back where it belonged. In November of 1882, she gave birth to a boy. He was born on a Tuesday, which Myrtle found appropriate given that Tuesdays had proven themselves consequential in her life, and he arrived with considerable announcement after a labor attended by the local doctor and by Cordelia, who was calm and practical and decisive, and who Myrtle realized, in that long, exhausting, determined day, was one of the best people she had ever known. Alfred sat outside the bedroom door for the entire duration and was, by Denton Marsh's later account, visibly gray by the end of it but absolutely immovable. When it was over and the doctor had declared everything well, and the baby had been cleaned and wrapped and placed in Myrtle's arms, Alfred came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression that was entirely new on his face. Not quiet, not steady, not measured. He looked undone and remade at the same time, like a house that has been taken down to its foundations and rebuilt better. "He's very loud," Alfred said. "He gets that from you," Myrtle said, which made no sense at all, since Alfred was the quietest man she had ever known, and she said it so deadpan that it took him a moment before he started laughing. They named him James for Alfred's father. Henry received James with the careful scientific interest he brought to all significant phenomena, and spent the first several weeks of James's existence maintaining a log of the infant's behaviors, which he called an observation journal, and which Clara illustrated with drawings that were impressively anatomically detailed for a 7-year-old. Cordelia deemed the journal extraordinary, and it was placed in the parlor shelf alongside Henry's geological notebooks. The years settled into themselves with the comfort of things that are exactly what they are supposed to be. 1883 brought a hard winter and a cattle market that struggled, and Alfred spent several months in the kind of methodical problem-solving that Myrtle now recognized as his most characteristic quality, not dramatic or defeated, just working through it, one day at a time, adjusting, adapting, finding what could be salvaged and accepting what couldn't. She helped with the accounts that winter, her mathematical training proving useful in ways neither of them had anticipated, and they worked at the kitchen table in the evenings while James slept and the wind threw itself against the stone walls of the house. "You are good at this," Alfred said one evening, watching her work through a column of figures. "Numbers don't lie," she said. "I find that restful. Most people find it tedious." "Most people didn't grow up needing everything to be reliable," she said. "Numbers are always what they are." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she looked up, and the look on his face was the one she had catalogued on the porch that first autumn, entirely open, entirely his. "I love you, Myrtle," he said. She turned her hand over and held his. "I know you do," she said. "It's the most reliable thing I know." The school at Haskell was doing well. By 1884, enrollment had grown to 51 students, which was more than a single teacher could manage indefinitely, and Myrtle had written repeatedly to the school board about hiring a second teacher. In the spring of 1884 they did, bringing a young woman named Miss Frances Delaney from Dallas who was 23 and tremendously competent, and Myrtle worked with her through the first term with the same fierce devotion she brought to everything she cared about. Frances was excellent, and by autumn Myrtle trusted her with the younger grades completely. This gave Myrtle something she had not had in years' time. Not entirely free time, because she was still the head teacher and still responsible for the school's direction, but afternoons that belonged to her in a different way. She began writing. Not correspondence, not the practical letters that had always kept her connected to the world, real writing, the kind she had been turning over in her mind for years. An account of teaching on the Texas frontier. The children she had known, the things they had taught her, the particular work of bringing learning to a land where survival took most of the available energy. Alfred found her writing at the kitchen table late one evening in September and asked what she was working on, and she told him, and he read the first several pages she showed him with the careful attention he gave everything, and when he was done he said, "This is very good, Myrtle. You should send it somewhere." "It's not done," she said. "When it's done," he said, "send it somewhere." She did, eventually, 2 years later in 1886, when it had become something close to finished. It was published in parts in a Texas educator's journal, and the response it generated surprised her with its warmth. She received letters from teachers across the state, from women in circumstances like her own, and from men on school boards who said it had changed their understanding of what their teachers were doing. She read one of these letters at the supper table, which produced a silence from Alfred that lasted approximately 30 seconds before he said, "I want to tell the children about this." Henry and Clara were told, and Henry received the news with solemn academic respect, and Clara said, "I knew you were a real writer," with the tone of someone whose theory has been confirmed. James, who was 3, said "Mama," and patted her hand, which she felt was the most genuine response of all. Cordelia Atkins turned 65 in the spring of 1884, and the party held for her at the ranch was the largest gathering the property had seen since James's christening ranch hands. Neighbors from 3 miles away, the Marsh family, the Delaney family from the school, Reverend Briggs and his wife from Haskell, and a collection of people from town who had found reasons over the years to know and respect the woman who ran the Atkins household. Myrtle organized it, quietly, over the course of 3 weeks, and Cordelia received the occasion with genuine surprise. The first time Myrtle had ever seen her caught entirely off guard. "You did this," Cordelia said to Myrtle quietly, while the tables in the yard were alive with people and food and late afternoon light. "Alfred helped," Myrtle said. "Alfred made sure there was enough firewood," Cordelia said. "You did this." She held Myrtle's gaze for a moment with those extraordinary eyes. You know, when I placed that advertisement, I hoped I did not know. I know, Myrtle said. I know you know, Cordelia said. I just want to say it out loud while I have the chance. You are the best thing that happened to this family, Myrtle, and I will not apologize for meddling to get you here. Myrtle laughed. I would not ask for an apology, she said. I thought the trap was a dark one at first. It was not dark at all. Traps made of love rarely are, Cordelia said. They stood together in the warm afternoon, and the sound of the family around them was exactly the sound of what they had both been working toward in their different ways, and it was everything. In the autumn of 1885, Myrtle found out she was expecting again. She told Alfred in the same kitchen, at the same table, and he received it with the same immediate concern for her well-being that he had the first time, which she found so characteristic of him, that his first instinct was always care. She was 29 now and healthy, and the second pregnancy was easier in some respects, harder in others, and she kept teaching through the first term with Francis managing the younger grades while she focused on the older ones. In June of 1886, she gave birth to a daughter, and they named her Ruth, for Alfred's maternal grandmother, and she arrived with reddish hair that none of the family could account for, and an expression that Cordelia described as highly skeptical, which seemed entirely appropriate for a child of Myrtle Morgan Atkins. James, now 3, inspected his sister with concentrated focus, and then looked at Alfred and said, "Smaller than the calf," which became a family saying thereafter. Ruth grew into herself with the combination of Alfred's steadiness and Myrtle's precision, and by the time she was 2, she was already showing the absolute determination to have opinions about everything that characterized her mother's approach to the world, which Alfred found deeply gratifying. Henry, in 1887, at 15, received a formal letter from the professor at Austin with whom he had been corresponding for 6 years, inviting him to attend a summer program at the university. Alfred and Myrtle read the letter together at the kitchen table, and both of them were quiet for a moment with the particular emotion of watching something you have nurtured from small reach toward its full height. Henry went to Austin that summer on the stage from Abilene, looking exactly as serious and determined as he had always looked, and he wrote home twice a week in his careful, precise hand. And the letters were full of things he had learned and people he had met, and the growing understanding that the work he had been doing since he was 9 was not just personal enthusiasm but a real thing, a contribution, a direction his life could take. He came back in September taller and different in a way that was not loss but expansion, and at supper that first night home, he told the family everything he had learned, and Alfred listened with the same entire undivided attention he had always given his son, and Myrtle watched them both and felt something that was not separate from her love but was its deepest expression, the satisfaction of having been part of something that mattered. Clara, at 16, was writing seriously by then. Her stories had grown from tales of talking horses into something more substantial. She was writing about the frontier, about the women on it, with a clear eye and an honest pen. Myrtle read every page she produced and gave her the same feedback she gave her students: specific, honest, never flattering unless the flattery was earned and then not withheld. "You are writing real things," Myrtle told her one afternoon. "These women are real." "I know them," Clara said. "I grew up watching them." Myrtle understood that this was, in part, about her, and she received it without false modesty. She had tried to show Clara something true about what a woman's life could contain, and she had apparently succeeded, and that was enough. Denton Marsh and his wife had a daughter who became Clara's close friend, and in the evenings sometimes the two girls could be heard on the porch with their heads together over Clara's notebooks, and the sound of their voices was exactly the sound of a future in the process of being invented. Alfred's ranch continued to grow carefully, not ambitiously, in the way he had always intended. The cattle herd was well managed and profitable, the land was maintained with attention, and the hands who worked for him were treated with a fairness that made the operation one that men sought out for employment. Denton Marsh had been with him 15 years by 1887 and showed no signs of going anywhere, and the two men had the easy shorthand of people who have been through difficulty together and come to trust each other completely. Myrtle had made the ranch her home in every sense of the word now, not by abandoning herself in it, but by bringing herself fully into it. Her books were on every shelf. Her writing at the kitchen table was a fixed feature of the household's evenings. Her opinions were aired at supper and taken seriously by everyone at the table, including James, who at 5 had developed a strong interest in everyone's opinions and a tendency to arbitrate disputes between Henry and Clara on points of fact with an authority that was funnier than it was effective. There were still hard things. In the winter of 1886, Cordelia had a spell of illness that frightened everyone and kept her in bed for 3 weeks with a chest complaint that the doctor treated with cautious optimism. Alfred sat with her in the evenings when the work was done, and Myrtle managed the household with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has internalized a place, and Henry kept his mother informed with regular updates on the medical literature available in his notebooks, and Clara read to Cordelia in the afternoons, and James brought her small stones from the yard, because he had absorbed enough of Henry's conviction to believe that rocks were meaningful gifts. Cordelia recovered, to no one's greater relief than Cordelia herself, who announced on her first day back at the kitchen stove that she had not built this household to lie about in a bed, and the family received this statement with an affectionate relief that made the kitchen feel very full. By 1888, Myrtle had been at the Atkins ranch for 7 years. She had been Mrs. Atkins for 6. She was 33, and she was exactly who she had been when she arrived: educated, precise, opinionated, passionate about her work. And she was also someone new, someone built by the addition of these people to the fixed structure of herself, someone who had learned that belonging somewhere did not cost you who you were but gave you more room to be it. One evening in the spring of that year, she and Alfred sat on the porch in the old way, the way they had sat when they were still being careful about what they felt, before they stopped being careful. James was in bed. Ruth was in bed. Henry was writing a letter to his professor in Austin. Clara was working on her latest story at the kitchen table. The night was warm and full of cricket sound, and the hills were dark against the last light in the west, and Alfred had his arm around her, and she had her head against his shoulder, and she was thinking about nothing in particular, just the feeling of the evening, just this exact collection of things that was her life. "Alfred," she said, "do you remember the first evening? When you came home and I was at the table and you didn't know I'd be there?" "I remember," he said. "What did you think when you saw me?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking honestly the way he always did. "I thought, and I know this is not very romantic," he said, "that someone had come home." She lifted her head to look at him. "What do you mean?" "I'd been running this ranch for 15 years, he said, "and it was mine and I worked for it and I was proud of it, but there was a way in which I was just keeping it going. And then I walked into that dining room and you were there and I thought, oh, there's someone who will change that." He paused. "I didn't know what I meant at the time. Now I know." "What did you mean?" she asked. "That someone had come home," he said again. "That the house had become what it was supposed to be." Myrtle looked at him for a long moment, and then she put her head back against his shoulder, and she thought about a place card with her name written on it in careful script, and about a 62-year-old woman with iron-gray hair and deep creek-water eyes who had read something in a person she had never met and set a place at her table with absolute conviction. And she thought about herself, the woman who had arrived at that table with her walls and her fears and her hard-won self-sufficiency and her refusal to need anything she hadn't built herself, and she thought about how that woman had sat down anyway, how the anger had cracked just wide enough, how the place had been set and she had filled it, and in filling it had not diminished but expanded. She had tried to refuse the invitation. Cordelia had already set her place at the table, and that act of stubborn, loving insistence had opened a door that Myrtle had been standing in front of for 26 years without knowing it was a door at all. She thought about the people who do not get second chances, and she felt for them, deeply and genuinely. And then she felt the warmth of Alfred's arm around her, and she held it closer, because gratitude for a thing and grief for those without it can both be true at once, and she was a woman precise enough to hold both. "Alfred," she said. "Yes. Thank you for asking me to come to that table." He pressed his lips to her hair. "Thank you for sitting down." Inside, Cordelia had put down her knitting and was in the kitchen doorway listening to the sound of the porch, and she was entirely at peace with everything she had ever done, including and especially the piece of paper she had pressed in careful letters 7 years ago and set beside a plate. Henry published his first geological paper in 1890, at 18, in a journal out of Austin. It was a study of the sedimentary formations in the hill country south of Haskell, and it referenced, in the acknowledgments, the observation journals he had kept since the age of 9 with the guidance of his mother, whom he described as having first shown him that everything in the world was worth looking at carefully. Myrtle read the acknowledgment 3 times, and then she set the journal down and composed herself, with some difficulty, before Alfred could see that she was crying. He saw anyway. He always did. Clara's first story was published in a Texas literary paper in 1891, when she was 16, and she received the news with a composure that made Myrtle recognize her own. The story was about a woman who came west alone and built something from nothing, and the woman in it was not based on Myrtle, Clara said, but on all the women she had ever known, and Myrtle thought that was exactly right. James, at 9, had inherited Henry's appetite for learning and Myrtle's precision, and his particular passion was mathematics. He had already, with Myrtle's help, worked through arithmetic well beyond his grade level, and was beginning geometry from a textbook she had ordered from St. Louis. He approached every problem with Henry's systematic thoroughness and Clara's absolute confidence that he would solve it, and he usually did. Ruth, at 5, was organizing everyone. She had been organizing everyone since she could talk, and the family had largely submitted to this with a mixture of amusement and genuine appreciation, because Ruth Atkins organized things efficiently, and had not yet been wrong about anything that needed organizing. She had opinions about how the kitchen should be stocked, about which order supper dishes should be served in, and about the proper placement of objects on every horizontal surface in the house. Alfred said she reminded him of Cordelia, which was the highest thing he could say, and Cordelia herself, who was 69 now and slower in the mornings but entirely herself, regarded Ruth with the deep satisfaction of someone recognizing a continuation. Myrtle taught at Haskell through 1892, by which time she had been the school's head teacher for 11 years, and the school had grown from 32 students in a single room to 68 students across 2 rooms with Frances Delaney as the second full-time teacher, and a part-time third teacher hired from Abilene. She had written her way into the conversation about frontier education in Texas, and her name was known in Austin and in educational circles that she had never expected to reach, and she went on knowing it with the same focused quality she brought to the kitchen table and the classroom and the porch in the evenings, fully present, fully herself, not performing for anyone's idea of what she should be. One evening in the autumn of 1892, when James and Ruth were in bed and the house had gone quiet, Myrtle was sitting with Alfred on the porch, and she realized, with the clean, simple certainty of something that has always been true, that she was happy, not performing happiness, not protecting herself from its loss by refusing to name it, not cataloging it as temporary or fragile or conditional, just happy, the way a house is warm thoroughly, structurally, from the foundation up. She had arrived in Haskell, Texas, in 1880 with a trunk of books and a borrowed determination, and the absolute conviction that she would not need anyone to save a place for her because she would make her own. And she had been right about the making. She had built everything she had built by her own effort and would not disown a single stone of it. But she had been wrong about the needing. She had needed this. She had needed Cordelia's stubborn conviction, and Alfred's unhurried love, and Henry's rock journals, and Clara's stories, and James's mathematical certainty, and Ruth's imperious organizational grip on everything within reach. She had needed this porch and these hills, and this enormous star-crowded sky, and this man beside her who had never once asked her to be less than entirely herself. She had tried to refuse the invitation. She was immeasurably grateful that the place had already been set. "What are you thinking?" Alfred asked. He always asked. He was always actually interested in the answer. "I'm thinking about a letter I got in September of 1880, she said, "from a woman I hadn't met yet." "My mother's advertisement." "Yes," she paused. "I almost didn't answer it." "I know," he said. "She told me." Myrtle looked at him. "What did she tell you?" "She said she received 3 responses to that advertisement," Alfred said, "and that she read yours twice before she read the others at all, and that she knew on the second reading that you were going to change everything." He paused. "She said she almost wrote back immediately, and then she made herself wait a day so she wouldn't seem— what was the word she used? Unhinged." Myrtle laughed. "Cordelia was never unhinged in her life." "That's what I said," Alfred agreed. She looked at the dark hills and then at him, and she took his hand the way she had that evening on the porch 7 years ago, her hand turning over to hold his. "Alfred," she said, "yes, I love this life." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to the back of it in the old-fashioned way, the way she had once found excessive in novels and now found exactly correct. "So do I," he said, "everything in it." Inside the house, James called out once in his sleep and was quiet. Ruth, in the room next door, sighed the profound sigh of a sleeping child entirely at peace with the world's arrangements. Cordelia's light was on in her room because she read late, because she had always read late, because she was Cordelia Atkins and she used every hour available to her. Henry's letter from Austin, arrived that morning, sat on the kitchen table waiting to be answered tomorrow. Clara's newest pages, filled with her careful, purposeful writing, were stacked beside it. The house held all of them. It had been built for permanence by a man who knew what permanence required, and it held. Myrtle Morgan Atkins sat on the porch in the warm Texas night with her husband beside her and her children sleeping inside and her mother-in-law's lamp burning in the window, and she was entirely, deeply, irrevocably home. Not because someone had given her a home, because she had sat down at the table, because she had let herself be loved. Because on a Sunday evening in the summer of 1881, a stubborn and tender and absolutely correct woman had set a place card with her name on it and refused to accept the word no from someone who did not yet know what she was saying yes to. And Myrtle Morgan had walked through the door, and everything had followed from that.